welcome to the Youth Forum podcast, a show designed to give youth a voice and to give an opportunity for people to share their views on important social issues. Today's topic, sexism in sports. It is no secret that female athletes receive far less recognition in comparison to their male counterparts. This is not only seen in professional sports when considering things such as payment and global or regional viewership, but it can even be seen in high school sports. The big question is, why? Why are females generally under-recognized in sports? There has been a lot of discussion for a while now about the differences in salary between males and females in competitive sports. Tennis was one of the only sports found by Forbes to have female and male athletes making generally comparable salaries when excluding Roger Federer. Actually, when looking at all of the highest paid athletes in 2021 women's sports, according to Forbes, 5 of them are tennis players. In addition, the Forbes data looking at the highest paid female athlete each year from 2012 to 2021 shows that the highest earner was consistently a tennis player. From 2012 to 2015, the highest earner was Maria Sharapova. From 2016 to 2019, the highest earner was Serena Williams, and from 2020 to 2021, the highest earner was Naomi Osaka. This general equality in pay within the profession of tennis is likely due to similar skill levels and levels of success across the board, which can be seen in statistics from a study run by Stephanie Kowalczyk. Kowalczyk looked at stats spanning from 2010 to 2014, and it was found that upsets, lower-ranked players beating higher-ranked players, were slightly more common in women's tennis with a 31.5% rate compared to the men's 29.6%. Maximum win streaks looked almost identical between the two genders. Females were more likely to experience a loss in the first or second round and then achieve a large win, known as a letdown, at Grand Slams. Otherwise, both men and women had about equal likelihoods of experiencing this. Women had more variability in their probability of winning matches at Grand Slam events. Otherwise, the probability was similar between men and women. And finally, women and men generally had consistent serves and returns, but at Masters and Premier 5+ tournaments, top female players were more likely to have an inconsistent serve or return when playing against higher-ranked players, whereas top male athletes had less consistency when playing against lower-ranked players. Overall, Kowalczyk looked at 6 different aspects of player performance, 3 of which showed no difference between performance when comparing the genders. Stats from Grand Slam events suggest that female tennis players are less consistent than their male counterparts when considering the following 3 aspects of performance: upsets, letdowns, and variation in win percentage. One thing that is interesting about the conclusion of Kowalczyk's study is that the events which showed inconsistency with females and not with males were Grand Slam events, which have different formats for the different genders. Female tennis players play a best-of-3 format, where the male tennis players play a best-of-5 format. Kowalczyk credits the difference between genders to this difference in format, as higher-ranked players are favored with the best-of-5 format. Kowalczyk determines that this would give a 9 percentage point win advantage to male tennis players, which is consistent with the data collected, which expresses an 8 percentage point difference between the 50% win advantage that male tennis players had and the 42% win advantage that female tennis players had. So payment for males and females in tennis seems to be fair. The next question then is, are other sports different? Team sports seem to generally have large pay gaps due to the lack of revenue for women's teams. Most revenue comes from viewership, and with that, we know that women's sports must have lower viewership in comparison to male teams for the same sport, based on the fact that they have lower revenue. This is confirmed by a lot of data, including that featured in a 30-year study which showed the following. First, 80% of sports highlights featured on news networks don't feature women's sports. And second, Televised and online discussion focused to women's sports makes up approximately 5.4% of airtime each. Women's hockey is an example of a sport that is underrepresented when compared with the male counterpart. The funny thing is that the only difference between how the games are played based on gender is that in women's hockey, full body checking is not allowed. This is the main thing that is accredited to the difference in viewership. Audiences like seeing when people get checked. When considering the pay gap, women in the NWHL make a salary between $5,000 a year and $7,000 a year, whereas NHL players make between $650,000 a year and $15.9 million a year. Women's basketball is also an example of a sport that is underrepresented in comparison to its male counterpart. The rules are very similar, but the women's sport is played with a slightly smaller ball and has a slightly smaller distance between the basket and the three-point line. In terms of the pay gap, it's not as drastic as is seen with hockey, but women's salaries start at $35,150, whereas the minimum salary for male players is $582,180. Therefore, the minimum salary for male basketball players is just over 1,656% of the women's minimum. I'm here today with Courtney, who is a hockey player. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored that you reached out. I'm really excited to talk sports with you.
I'm so thankful that I'm able to speak with you today. Yeah, so I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. The first of which is, do you find that women's hockey is refereed differently than the male counterpart?
I do. Overall, I would say there's not too many differences, but I think because there are certain aspects of the game that are different in terms of rules and equipment that is worn, that does come into play. But generally, I would say I don't think there's many differences in terms of the basic rules like offsides, icings, penalties. Between men and women's hockey, you would find certain penalties are easier to distinguish. So, for example, in the NHL, men wear visors on their face. So if you were to get high sticked and you're bleeding, it's a little bit more obvious. But overall, I don't think there's a huge difference in terms of the overall rules. All the refs take the same courses, and there's no in the reffing courses for professionals, there's no actual different protocol that each ref has to follow for a men and women's league. So it's pretty much the same, despite the minor differences in terms of the game rules and equipment differences.
For sure. My next question is, do you think that changing some of those rules, like lifting the full body checking ban in women's hockey or placing more rules on checking in men's hockey, for example, do you think that this would increase women's hockey viewership? And what impacts would you say would occur due to changing the rules?
In my opinion, I actually don't think that would change the viewership. Personally, I view women and men's hockey as not different sports, but I respect each for what it is on its own. So if you watch men's hockey versus women's hockey, it's the way that the game is played in terms of systems is different, because you see different skills in the NHL versus World Championship in women's hockey. And I think that people who really love the sport will watch it for what it is. They don't watch it for the hitting necessarily. And I think if you even were to change it, in my opinion now, if you were to say tomorrow that, the women in the Olympics or the World Juniors, they were allowed to hit, I actually don't think that much would change, because the game is still very physical. There's just no open ice hitting, and these women have been playing this game this way for so long that I think it would actually be more difficult for them to transition to something, or it wouldn't make as much of a difference as people think. So in terms of viewership, yeah, I think people will watch it for what it is. Like, personally, I love watching women's hockey, and I think if people watch it more, they'll they'll see that there's not much of a difference. Like even in the NHL, there's, big hits here and there, but overall, you're there to watch the game for the game. You're not really there to watch the fighting or the hitting. In my opinion, like you take the same with soccer, right?
Yeah.
There's no different rules in women's soccer versus men's soccer, and the viewership still differs. So people are going to watch what they want to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just my opinion.
For sure. I completely agree. I mean, it's very unfortunate that the viewership is so different. And this plays into my next question, which pay gap and the pay for each sport is based off of the viewership. So I guess my question is, how do you feel about the pay gap between men's and women's sports?
Like all sports in general?
I mean, all sports in general and hockey as
Yeah,
well.
for sure. So my biggest thing is equal opportunity, right? So I believe at the end of the day, you can't force equal pay. Like that's just unfair. It is really unfortunate, the wage gap. But you take, Serena Williams, for example,
Mhm.
and women's tennis versus men's tennis. Women's tennis is huge. And I
Mhm.
think it comes down to, people are going to pay what they're willing to in something like an input market where you have things like superstar talent. So in terms of, I think, sport in general, let's say you have somebody who's a swimmer, regardless of their gender, and you have somebody who's a tennis player. If tennis is more popular than swimming, you're going to get that viewership. They might get paid more. We can't, you know, just in business in general, you can't go out and be paying
Mhm.
well the same amounts if they're just not getting the views. But I think it comes down to, and like for the future of sports, something I really love is that in the States, when they give scholarships to women and men's sports, they have a rule in the NCAA for sports where however much money you allocate to a men's sport, you have to give the exact same amount to a women's sport. So it
Oh,
has to be equal. And I really like that because that's giving you, everybody's starting at the same point.
mhm.
I think that's the most important step is kind of peeling back all of these layers and making sure that at the start everybody's given an equal chance, and then from there it is up to what the people enjoy watching.
Mhm.
But I think the biggest thing would be starting with that, and then as well as like mainstream television programming. So um if there are biases in sport, like putting on, broadcasters need to be a little bit brave, right? So if
Mhm.
there's a women's hockey championship on and you put on, darts and bowling before a
Mhm.
world championship for women's sport, um, that could be a little bit of a viewership bias, right? So
Mhm.
exposure to content. But in terms of equal opportunity, I think you can't force equal pay. And there are, even in the UFC, there are tons of fighters who are women who are, worth a lot of money. But it just does come down to what people are willing to watch at the end of the day.
Absolutely. My next question is, what do you want to see in the future of women's sports, both in comparison to men's sports and just on its own?
I mean, I think over the past years, women's sports in general have made many improvements. I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of young women still face, but less often now than more, is staying committed to their sport at a younger age. So we see now a lot of youth programs specific to women in hockey, soccer. The biggest thing is now you can see a little girl walk into a rink with a hockey bag and a hockey stick, and nobody takes a second look.
Hmm.
Or, even when I played, there were, we played hockey when we were younger, and you'd play on an all boys team, and there'd be one or two girls on the team. And now you have entire leagues, entire teams, entire organizations dedicated to promoting female in sport. So I think it does start at a young age. And I think the future of women in sport is looking much more positive with all of the openings and opportunities that young women and girls have to be encouraged to play sport and stay confident. And then
Hmm.
again, I think it would also just be the broadcasting and the exposure to it,
Hmm.
making sure we're promoting it equally. That being said, if there's no budget, like if we're not getting as many views as the men's sports and you have a limited budget to promote, you can only do so much.
Hmm.
But I do really think that women in sport is something that has continued to trend. And I think as long as people keep working hard to invest and dedicate their time to making sure that things are fair from the start, and that we do what we can to basically promote women's sports and encourage it, without, without putting down men's sports, because they're different things in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, what people are willing to watch. And I think we just have to respect each for each its own.
Definitely,
Yeah.
yes. And my last and final question is, do you have any other comments you want to make about sexism and bias in sports?
Um, Bias, I mean, there's been so many events. You had the March Madness incident, with the basketball. And I think the biggest thing is, I try my best to have an unbiased opinion, because I don't do tons of research into this. Like, I've grown up playing a sport. Obviously, there is discrimination in the world in terms of not just sexism, but racism in sport and representing country. But I think one of the big things that I like is the awareness, and educating and awareness is our two main factors that we can control. And I think if we continue to do that, it's going to really help the future of women's sports. And I also like, in the Olympics, how they have the mixed relays. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really cool. So you have your women's sports and you have your men's sports, and at the end of the day, like, you know men and women are biologically different. Like, there are biological reasons why, men might be faster, stronger, they have more testosterone in their bodies. But I think encouraging all, as long as everybody's respected and treated as equals in the beginning, like, that's the most important part. And I think it's really cool how we're starting to see mixed sports and mixed relays. And the respect in sport is the big thing for me. So equity, respect, and all of those factors, education, awareness, it's a powerhouse for the future of women's sports in all levels: college, young girls and women, and in university, and then in the Olympics. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's improved, but there still is a lot of room for improvement.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I greatly appreciate your insight and you taking the time to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I hope that, this podcast gets a lot of views, and I hope that people like what we talked about today. So thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you very much.